After a speedboat and a very bumpy bus journey, we arrived at our first main stop in Colombia, Cartagena. We arrived late and went to our budget hotel, Luna Llena, which we may have forgot to film. Then the next morning we were up early to do a walking tour of the city, starting at these large city walls and moving into the old town. The architecture in the city was absolutely stunning, but unfortunately our walking tour was a bit of a tourist trap, and we covered a very small section of the city, and the tour covered a very short period of history, which excluded anything past the Spanish arriving many years ago. Beth was suitably impressed with the building materials used in the city. Some of these older buildings were made of coral mixed with limestone. After the tour, we had our own wander around the city and were blown away by the beauty of the streets, along with the city's large cedar fences which surrounded the entire old town. In the afternoon, we saw this sleepy girl at the shopping centre. That evening, we explored the city by night, which was filled with street performers, countless food vendors, and a surprisingly large amount of people trying to sell us cocaine. But instead I settled for this large plate of meat and cheese, followed by a few drinks and then straight to bed.
The next day Jack was still hungry for his fix of history, so we visited Castillo de San Felipe de Barajas, a fortress built in the 1600s and was involved in loads of different battles over the years with other European powers. The fortress was absolutely massive and had some great views over Cartagena. The weather in Cartagena was about 34 degrees, but honestly felt like it was about 40 degrees. And we found this air-conditioned room that showed this video all about the history of the castle, and it was about 10 degrees in there. So we stayed in there mainly for the aircon, but also the video was quite interesting and taught us way more than the walking tour on the previous day. There were also loads of underground tunnels built for someone of exactly my height, which also made for good hiding places and great echoes. After this we went to a cafe where Jack tried his first ever frappuccino, which he liked, and then went back out again later in the day for another wander around the city centre, for another look at the pretty streets, had a bit more street food, and then found a rooftop bar for sunset, and then had more street food.
We left Cartagena the next day, en route for the port town of Santa Marta, on a minibus with very tinted windows. Our next accommodation was Hostel Tamarindo, above a very loud dive shop. We took a stroll around the city's waterfront, saw some of the beautiful Santa Marta churches, had a quick snack, and it was back to get packing for our 4-day hike in the Sierra Nevada mountains. But first, some self-care with these well-fitting face masks. We were picked up and driven 40 metres down the road to the main tour shop before starting our journey. The first section was an hour and a half by road, followed by about 45 minutes of being thrown around the vehicle off-road, while we were driven to the small village of Machete. We hadn't really researched the hike, so we felt a bit underprepared. After seeing this guy in jeans with no water, we felt a lot better. The journey started out quite relaxed, as we followed a wide open trail along the side of a river, and we were a tad confused after reading all the reviews about how difficult it was. We had some fantastic views at our first stop, then the hill climbs really started, and what goes up must come down, with lots of muddy and uneven downhill sections. At which point we realised this might not be as easy as we first thought, but we carried on going up and downhill, following our local guide and keeping an eye out for wildlife, which the guys weren't particularly interested in, except for this wasp that had paralysed a spider and then a tourist had accidentally trod on. Finally, after 4 hours of hiking, we made it to our first accommodation, which came with some much needed morale for Beth, in the form of this furry boy. We threw on our swimwear and headed to the accommodation's local swimming spot, where we laid in some nice cold water to soothe our aching legs. We got all our kit organised for the next day and checked out our beds for the night, which were bunk beds under a big tin roof. We had an early dinner and then headed to bed, ensuring our mosquito nets were fully in place to stop our new friends from getting in.
The next day we were up at 5 AM to get out hiking again. The whole trail is about 60 kilometres long, and today was the first long day of hiking. The Sierra Nevada mountain range is a dedicated UNESCO biosphere reserve, and it's home to 4 main tribes: the Kogi, the Wiwa, the Arhuaco and Canquamo, who lived in distant villages in the hills, maintaining their traditional way of life and resisting modern influences. Part of the trip included a visit to the Wiwa community, where they showed us how they get the material for women to weave their bags with, which they call mochilas, and here's an example. They take a big fika leaf and keep scraping it until they're left with these white fibres, and then they dry the fibres in the sun and then twist them into a thread. He also played us a sick tune on his homemade recorder. We then carried on with the hike, taking in the beautiful scenery and sights of the jungle. You can't really tell from the videos, but it was really hot and sweaty. The temperature was about 32 degrees and the humidity was about 90%. So the whole time your body just felt like it was leaking from everywhere. And none of your clothes dried because it was just too humid. Although I don't think Mother Nature thought we were wet enough. So she decided to send a torrential downpour our way. We hiked holding our umbrellas above our head for the rest of the afternoon, which somehow managed to keep our feet somewhat dry. When we got to the accommodation, we bagsied our bunk bed and then headed out for another refreshing dip in the river, where I saw some weird creatures. We had a fat spaghetti bolognese for tea, received one standard issue kitten blanket, and then finished the night watching a series in bed.
We were up at 5 o'clock for breakfast, and today was the day we were finally going to visit the lost city. We set off walking across some incredibly sketchy old bridges, located above some torrential rapids that hadn't been maintained since the day they'd been installed. We then continued up the mud banks, followed the river upstream, crossed some even sketchier bridges than before, until finally we reached the bottom of the trail to the lost city. At which point began the stair section of the journey, which totaled 1,200 to get to the top, and they were incredibly steep and covered in lots of slippery moss, and they just seemed to keep going and going, and this was constant for about half an hour. By the top, everyone was absolutely exhausted, apart from Beth, who decided she wanted to do a couple of hill sprints. We had finally made it to the top, but before we could enter, we had to discharge our negative energy, not by petting this dog though. Instead, we were given a big coca seed in which to discharge this negative energy, and then we gave it as an offering to enter the sacred site. The site predates Machu Picchu by about 650 years. And because it was the rainy season, there were barely any tourists there. There were maps carved into large pieces of stone, which depicted routes and locations to other settlements in the area. Originally, this settlement contained between 2,000 and 8,000 people. But after European colonizers started enslaving the indigenous people, and the colonizers became hostile in search of gold, the city was abandoned, and the indigenous people moved further into the mountains. Eventually, in 1973, the site was rediscovered by some Indiana Jones-like fellows who were in the business of robbing the graves for the gold. In the 80s and 90s, the area was heavily affected by the drugs trade, and lots of guerrilla and paramilitary groups roamed the area, claiming territories to grow narcotics. But since 2005, the area has been safe to visit. Then it was time to head back down those stairs and start that long walk to the start again. The stairs down were tough at the best of times, but when you were knackered from 2.5 days walking, it made it even worse. Once we had finally reached the bottom, it was time to follow those muddy paths and cross those dodgy bridges all over again. There were some fantastic waterfalls on the way back to look at, and we knew how far we had to go by following these incredibly specific signs. Failing that, the stray dogs knew we were on the way to lunch, and they clearly walked the route regularly in hopes of getting hold of some scraps. The indigenous transported most of their stuff via donkey, that were usually running wildly along the paths, to deliver it to their small settlements where they lived without electricity or modern equipment. Eventually we made it back to our accommodation for the night. After around 7 hours of walking that day, we got straight in, had a wash, then sat down for another fantastic meal of soup, rice and chicken with this hungry girl. We then got ourselves ready for bed, made sure there were no bugs in our mosquito nets, then had an emergency toilet stop before bed, where frustratingly all the urinals were busy being used by the local toads.
The next day was the final day of the hike, with around 7 more hours to go till we got back to the start, and today the paths were even muddier. But again, the difficult sections were made better by the beautiful scenery, the sounds of nature, and the sight of these vultures drying their wings off in the heat of the day. We ended back at the same place as we started, with a slap-up lunch, although Jack refused to try the fish because he said it looked too gross. Then we got a jeep back to the accommodation where we slept for the rest of the day. The next 2 days were basically spent exploring Santa Marta, eating a load of junk food, and drinking loads of frappuccinos and beer. There wasn't loads to do here, but there were a couple of nice squares, quite a big exercise park, and a nice beach to sit on to watch sunset. In the evening, the main square was pretty dead, but all the side streets were rammed full of bars, including this Mexican restaurant with all-you-can-eat tacos. Jack obviously went for it, and ended up eating 18 tacos.
It was our last day in Santa Marta, so we packed up and headed to the bus station, ready for our 16-hour overnight transfer to Medellin on this swish up-to-date bus with tellies in the seats. The journey started well, but after a baby joined the bus near Cartagena, we didn't get a lot of sleep.
I'll save it.